feel, I mean, you must have this experience too as a writer, that there's something about a finished product that presents itself with a kind of inevitability, you know, and then it's easy for people, you know, who don't normally practice that particular type of writing or that particular type of art to sort of imagine that it was all planned. because the end result is generally more polished. So it's kind of like this, and I think that's particularly true for poetry. It has this sort of feeling of inevitability about it a lot of the time, like kind of like, and it's like, no, you don't, you know, the amount of mistakes that were made or wrong turns or cul-de-sacs and just general effing around that happens is, you know, I think is interesting. And I wanted to write about that. You know, I wanted to write my way into that and sort of reveal that process. I would like to read a book like this, you know, that's about the process of making something by almost any artist who I'm interested in. You know, I think it's cool, like, to hear. I would love to, you know, that's kind of a little bit what this podcast is, I think, for you. So we get inside your process of making, which is those are some of my favorite episodes. I love that when you talk about that or when you touch on that with people.
Well, I think people who are creators love to read books that get into the process of creation and sort of become about their own making. And I was reading, you know, as I was prepping for the conversation, about the point at which you arrived at an understanding of what story of a poem is ultimately about. Mm-hmm. That's always, I think that's often a process for people who are working on any book length project. You're sort of working your way to an understanding of what it is you're up to. And you said that this book, and it made a lot of sense to me when I read it, is about changing and revising my life and a poem. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's the elegant one-liner. It catches it all, but it takes so long to get to that elegant one-liner.
I didn't understand. Well, I had an instinct, you know, about this book, and it was very different. So, you know, you mentioned why poetry. That was a book that began with kind of like a particular sort of motivation. It was like, can I explain poetry to people who are interested but feel shut out of it somehow, basically? I was like, and what would happen if I took on that task seriously? So it almost began from the outside in. It was kind of like, I have a thing I want to do. Let's see if I can do it. And then this book is the opposite. It comes from the inside out in a way. It came from an inchoate kind of like, you know, almost like vegetal being drawn towards some kind of an idea that, like, there's something here that I need to figure out. So I'm just going to start writing every day and put it down, sort it out later. And then, so it did take me a long time to know what I was trying to do with this book. And along the way, at times I wasn't even sure that it was a book. You know, maybe it was just writing to get to something else. I didn't know.
And I think I read you were writing every day and you were kind of exchanging pages with a friend, right?
Yeah. So Catherine Barnett, who's a poet who lives in New York, and I agreed to send each other 500 words a day minimum, just each day, every day, 5 a minute, you know, and the only way we were supposed to respond to each other was to say thank you, because just not to do, no, it's not workshopping. It wasn't evaluative or whatever. And the only task was to sit down each day. And so, you know, do it. And it became this incredibly pleasurable act. I just loved it. It was like, I was joking with someone the other day that was like, when you start exercising, you know, or meditating, you're familiar with that, you know, and you do it and then you're just like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. Like, I'm never going to stop. And then, like, of course you do.
Yeah.
You know, I do, maybe you don't, but I do. And I'm like, ugh, like, you know, and then, but it's like when you're in that thing, you're like, why don't I always live this way? You know, why don't I always cook at home? You know?
Right.
You know?
Right.
No more takeout. But the, you know, so it was that process lasted, you know, 4 or 5 months of daily writing like that. And I loved doing it. And I would write about whatever was on my mind. And, you know, and it ended up being something like 125,000 words, I think, at the end, you know, just this huge pile of stuff. And then I had to go in and be like, what is this? I did have the idea of starting with a poem, you know, just a very rough draft of a poem and writing through it to see what would happen. That was kind of like something I kept touching on during those months. So I had a little bit of a kind of thing I was trying to do. But other than that, I had no idea. And I also knew that I needed to write about some things that were difficult in my personal life, and just the difficult time we were in. And so I just threw myself in, I guess.
I was going to ask you, because this book is obviously about poetry, and there is, as we were just, you know, as we've been discussing, the craft element, but it's also a very personal book about parenthood, and in particular what it means to be the parent of a neurodivergent child. and all of the fear and anxiety and heartbreak and sort of like crushing love that happens to a person, as I well know, when your child is atypical. So you had that on your mind clearly, and you knew you were going to write about it.
Yeah, I think I had the instinct, the feeling that I knew that there was something in me that needed to change. And, I'm a big fan of therapy. I'm a big fan of, talking with friends and meditate, all those things. But I think I also knew that I had to write my way through it. And I just had an instinct, and I didn't know if I was right, that there was something about writing the arc of a single poem and understanding my own life better that were connected. I didn't know how or why or how that was going to work out, but I just kind of thought that that feels right to me. And I just knew the only way to figure it out was to do it. And if I was wrong, well, then I would have just written for months and something else would happen. But the very vague idea that there was a connection there and something to learn and something to change in myself and also in a poem, and that those things were related, that vague idea was inside me. And the only way to pursue it was just to write my way into it.
Okay, so another question about this process, because I really love this idea, especially in the early going where you really don't know exactly what you're even up to, but you're enforcing a discipline upon yourself in this cooperative way with a writer friend, and you've just made this commitment to send 500 words a day to each other. I get how that discipline can be super helpful, and just being generative, just getting words on the page obviously makes a difference, and you can sort it out later and find the gold in the big pile of rubble or whatever. But one question that comes to mind for me is what it was like to receive 500 words from somebody every day and to read their work in progress, which is a pretty intimate thing, right? Somebody's sorting through stuff and writing about personal stuff and just trying to kind of push internal buttons and see what's there. What was the reading process like and the receiving process like, and how did it maybe impact your work and your understanding of it?
Such a great question. And I have not been asked, whatever. It was very, what was it like? Well, I'll step back and say the interesting thing about Catherine to me is she's one of those people who, I love her poems.
And say her name again, just for
Catherine
listeners.
Barnett is her name, and she's published several books of poems. She's an amazing, amazing poet. And she's one of those people, and we all have them in our lives, that you kind of meet and you feel like you already had met them a bunch of times before. Like we just hit it off. Like we had we were just friendly, but in a different kind of way where we we're like on the same, whatever frequency or something. But I don't really know her or much about her life. So she was the perfect person to do this with, because I felt a kind of ease with her, but I also had to explain everything, and vice versa. She had to explain, and she was going through some stuff in her own life. And so she had to explain everything to me. And I loved getting her notes. And it was kind of great because I would get up early in the morning, because that's just like the best time for me before everything breaks into complete chaos, as you know. And so I would do it real early, like maybe like 5 a.m. or something like that, usually. And then I'd be like, on my way. And I would often get something at like 11:52 p.m., or whatever, like right at the end here, and it was great because it was so intimate, the way she wrote about exactly where she was and like what she was struggling with. And she wrote a lot about, she lives in New York, and she wrote a lot about like the weather or like the way things sounded or what it was like to walk on the street and what she was reading, what she was thinking about. It was so great to get her daily things. I looked forward to them. They felt that I just loved reading. And it was like reading a long thing a friend wrote just for days and days and months. It was awesome. I loved it. It was very heartening. And I felt less by myself, I just felt connected to somebody in that kind of way,
And just that basic accountability too. And just that shot of maybe energy and inspiration that you get when somebody's sending you, especially when the work has like real life in it, even if it's not fully rendered, you know what I'm saying? Like you get that juice from,
well, and also I should just want to add, I'm sorry to interrupt, but she would write about something, and then so I'd often get her email at like 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night. I read it, and then, or I'd read it first thing in the morning when I got up. And then I would respond to her, And so if she had mentioned she was reading something, she might, and then I might, if I had read it or I had different, I would write her back, or she might write about some issue about writing, and then I would write her back about it, and then she would write me. So we were like actually in correspondence and talking with each other. Like that was another part of it. It was not, we weren't workshopping each other, like I said, or like evaluating or praising, but like we were talking with each other. We were in this long conversation.
And the pages that you're sending from the jump were dealing with the poetry stuff, obviously, but the personal stuff too, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, I just went right there. I mean, I think, like I said, because I trusted her. I think a different person might have been a little more self-protective or try to present myself in a kind of way, but for whatever reason, I didn't feel like I had to do that with her. And so I was fortunate in that way, and maybe even reckless. I think there's something a bit reckless about just, you know this because you've written this way. Once you're writing about your kid or your family or parents, there's a lot of issues come up, ethical issues basically. And so it was important, I think, for me to not worry about those things at that stage of the writing.
Right.
I knew, I was like, that will come later. I will deal with that later.
There's a line that you quote in the book, famous line from Susan Sontag. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick, I believe is the line. Mm-hmm. And this book is about, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's about that change from living in the kingdom of the well and then moving into maybe the kingdom of the unwell. And I relate very much to that experience. We're sort of in the same boat. For listeners who don't know, both of us have atypical kids, different diagnoses, but have both been through that challenge as parents. And something that I think about creatively from a personal perspective is how inevitable seeming it became to me that I would have to write about it. Mm-hmm. Not as a creative issue, but just as a survival issue. Mm-hmm. You have to, what are you going to do? We're writerly to begin with, but I was having a conversation with a friend of mine recently. This friend also has a disabled child, and we were talking, and the friend was like, I don't know if I'm going to write about it. And immediately I was sort of like, I think you will. My friend is a writer, and I'm like, I'm posing this because I want to know if it feels familiar to you or if you disagree. But it's almost absurd after something like this happens, after you get a very difficult diagnosis and your life changes irrevocably in a very powerful way. Isn't it kind of absurd to think, as a creative person, as an artist, that you would then sit down and write about something that did not address this?
Yeah. For me, it would be absurd. Yeah. That was not an option. And I think, my previous book of poems, Father's Day, that book of poems it was very much like in the kind of, middle of the first stages of kind of like being informed that my son was, autistic, and like, what does that mean? I don't even know what that means. Like, this was very inside, like a kind of like really a period of a lot of turmoil. And that information came to me, a month after Trump was elected. And that was also really, there was a lot of other stuff that was going on in the Bay Area that was really kind of scary, and, and felt out of control. The whole situation felt out of control there. There was a lot of, there was the ghost ship fire that happened and other things that were going. So just everything felt really unstable. And so that book of poems is really inside that experience, I think. And and in a lot of ways, I think it reflects some of the rawest and most difficult moments of first coming to terms with the fact that my story and the story of my family was going to be different from some sort of idealized version, which probably no one gets to live anyway, but whatever naive ideas I had about something. But then this book is more, I think it's a few years after we got that information about our son, and I was getting to know him so much better, as we all do with our kids as time goes on. And so I think it's more like about, I think I like I said, I think I knew that I needed to change some stuff in myself because I was missing out on being a really happy parent and enjoying my kid as much as I think I could. And I think it's true that that the book did teach me something about that. It didn't teach me, oh, everything's fine and there's no problems or something, but it's like that, just that, letting go of some things inside myself, that were just holding me back.
Yeah, like
that experience at all too, or have had that experience with your kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think the word that comes to mind when it comes to dealing with something like this is acceptance. That's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I find myself in a not so great state, like fear, worry, sadness, self-pity, I'm usually in a state of unacceptance or non-acceptance of what is. And when I am accepting of everything just as it is, which does sometimes happen, that is when things are easiest.
Yeah.
And I am able to function best as a parent. And I don't think anyone's going to bat 1,000 with this stuff. I think, all things being equal, I think
happen to be above the Mendoza line.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, you talk about,
is that what it is?
Say again?
Is that 250 or 200? What is batting? I can remember.
Yeah, something like that.
But at a time I could get there. It's pretty good.
I'd take 250.
But I mean, I think what you're saying is really so true. And I mean, I really, I think even sharing this with other people is worthwhile. Just the fact that. But I mean, I also think, I mean, and I'm sure you would agree. I mean, it's no breaking news that we live in an incredibly ableist society. And I internalized that stuff. I grew up in a certain kind of way around people who were, presented themselves at least as neurotypical and healthy or whatever. And, it was, the kingdom of the well, the kingdom of the privileged, the kingdom of the housed, the kingdom of the straight, the kingdom of the cisgendered, all this stuff. Like, that's the kingdom I grew up in. And I didn't know that was the kingdom I grew up in. And, and then over time you realize that, and you realize you have a lot of stuff in you that you need to work through so that you don't perpetrate things on other people. And that's a big process that I think a lot of us have been going through, especially intensely over the past couple of years. And nobody deserves a medal for that. It's just part of not being a total massive asshole. And, but then when this particular situation, and you can relate, I'm sure you get this particular version of intense encounter with your own ableism, which I didn't ask for that. I don't think that's right. I don't believe in that, yet it's in me. So what was I going to do? How was I going to work through that? And I think that, writing through it particularly writing a poem, and trying to revise was helping me, work through that stuff inside myself. And that's what was keeping me from really seeing and appreciating my son. It was my own bullshit that was inside myself. There's nothing wrong with my kid.
Right.
There's something wrong with the world.
Yeah.
And I really believe that. I think I was completely wrong about these issues.
Yeah. It's funny. I in my book, there's a section where I write about, and it's writing from a personal place, where like after the diagnosis happens, I'm like out in public, and suddenly like everywhere I look, I'm seeing people with disabilities.
Right. I remember that was an intense part of your book, and I've had a very similar experience.
Yeah, where you're going,
of gift. It's a kind of gift, because you really start to see people. You're like, holy shit, like this world is full of. I mean, I first had that experience when my dad died, and I was like, oh my God, everybody's dad is dead or gonna die. Like I just remember thinking that, like, oh, that's why everybody's so freaked out all the time. And like, I just realized it suddenly, that like people, I mean, it's so naive. I was such a child in a way, emotionally, before these things happened. And,
do you ever think about like the ways that, experience is the best teacher, right? And then you go through the process of, your child is diagnosed, it's terrifying and heartbreaking, but it also delivers greater compassion, hopefully. And then this just deeper awareness, as you're saying.
mm-hmm.
You ever think to yourself, like, man, this is what it takes for me to just be aware of the struggles, all the blind spots that we have, like as human beings, just generally. And I, myself included, yourself included. Like, I guess I wish that my moral imagination were stronger and that I had more sensitivity. I still have blind spots.
Well, I think I think it's not going to come as any breaking news that, white straight dudes, kind of sail through in a lot of ways. And so, so I think when you smash into something like this, it can be a bigger shock because, like most people in this world don't go through life being protected in the way that I just speak for myself, the way that I was. And so, smashing into difficulties, was quite an education in the poverty of my moral imagination, I would say, to go off of what you're saying. But I think there's a lot of other people who would be like, yeah, dude, welcome to the club, welcome to things not on the fucking working out exactly the way you want them to all the time.
Right.
Like, not that they, you know what I mean. And so I think, I thought a lot about that, and just like, man, I didn't understand anything about what people were going through, I guess, and it's like, I hope it's made me more, like, at least gentle with people, like, I think just like, because I would like some gentleness applied to me when I'm out in the world, because I'm maybe had a rough day or something, and I mean, I just think, like I said, I mean, I have all these things swirling around, and then there's like this poem, and I'm trying to be like, what's the relationship here? Why does this feel so connected to me, writing poems and trying to be a a less sucky human being? I don't know.
There's a passage in your book that I want to read that speaks to this, the stuff that we've been talking about, where you say, and I should say too, I believe this must be from the beginning of the book because it's written in the third person.
Right. Yeah.
The book begins in third and then shifts to first.
Yeah, we could talk about that if you want later.
Yeah, but I loved that choice. I love this opening section that sort of looks at things maybe from, 35,000 feet or whatever, and kind of just lays out the stakes. But you write, they had been stars in school, high achievers who went to colleges with impressive names and had succeeded professionally at the highest levels. Now they were on the other side of that wall. The grievous limitations of the pervasive, ruthless, meritocratic machine into which they had so willingly and unquestioningly inserted themselves in order to emerge on the other end as highly valued products became painfully obvious. The experience of being people who needed help and often merited compassion felt intolerable and utterly necessary. That resonated with me, that paragraph, because it has been uncomfortable for me in the wake of my son's diagnosis to suddenly find myself in that role. I am so much more comfortable thinking of myself as the person who gives the help rather than the person who needs it.
You're the host.
Yeah. I mean, right? Yeah. I'm happy to be. I love to do that. But
You're
man,
the host, you're the narrator, you're the dad, you're the caretaker, you're the helper. People come to you with problems, Yeah. Sure.
and you're likewise, you're the teacher, the dad, like that's just like,
Right.
and then suddenly things get flipped. And, the other thing, there's another line that you wrote that I underlined where you say there is a singular terror when the story is suddenly taken away and one is left in a new life. I mean, it's disruptive. And you know what? This will happen if you live long enough. This happens to everybody one way or another.
It happens to everybody. That's the thing. It happens to everybody. And I mean, that's, and I mean, it's then, like you said, you look around and you're like, you just feel differently about people around you, and I really felt that. And I think that it was quite a shock to realize that I was not, living, that the values I had, some of the values I had were superficial, let's say. And to be like, okay, wait, like, when it comes to my own life, I don't, have the same, kind of, compassion and understanding that I would have said I had towards, like, I'm thinking about ableism again in particular, but, I think I didn't write a lot about this in the book. I have an essay that's in Harper's that I removed from the book that's kind of more about this, but it's the link between this and white supremacy. I mean, which is really, I think it's almost too obvious to point out, but like that, there's a kind of reckoning there too, that those of us who are white and privileged have to do with ourselves and continue to do with ourselves in order. I really believe that. like that we might think we're X and Y and Z way, but then when it comes down to it, like, are we doing what we need to do? And it's a constant process. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to open up that process, to say, we're like, I am in process, and I think this need to present oneself as like a perfect, result of a bunch of, but reading, what's her name, Robin DiAngelo books or something, is like, or that I'm not prejudiced, or I'm not this, or I'm not that, is like, that's a thing that leads to more violence, I think, actually. So, I was trying to do that, and that's, revising the poem somehow seems part of that too, like kind of being willing to work on things and being willing to show that I'm working on things, I guess, was important to me,
And let's talk about, while we're here, that decision to open the book in the third and then shift to the first, because I know from having researched a bit that you struggled a lot with how to open this book.
Yeah, it was brutal. Yeah, because I mean, if you go back, I'd written blah blah blah, written a ton of things, like over 100,000 words. So I had a lot of stuff, but how was I going to frame this? Like, and there was sort of this arc of starting the poem and finishing it that was there, vague kind of, like arc, but like you can't just start. I knew I couldn't just start the book there, because people would be like, what are you doing? Like writing a poem, like what are these? Like in the book, there are these facsimiles, of the typewritten pages, and people be like, what is this? What is this thing that's there? And I knew that because I'd showed it to people without a preface, and they were all confused, including my wife, who's a very good reader and knows me quite well.
I should interject and say that if your wife is confused by your memoir, it might be a bad sign.
Yeah, if your wife doesn't understand your memoir that's about your life and your family life, then probably needs some work. Yeah. But yeah, and so I knew I needed a preface, but God, I tried so many different ways, and I have all these drafts, and they're all awful in different, and it's kind of amazing. It's almost like a taxonomy of awfulness, of like ways that you can, like, sometimes they're really like mansplaining and pretentious, and then sometimes they're like cloyingly self-deprecating in a way that's also egotistical, and sometimes they're just confusing, like they don't help at all. It's like 12 pages, and then it's like they didn't explain actually what's going on. So I could not figure it out. I tried and tried and tried, and then I remembered that I had been in a lecture by a friend of mine named Rachel Howard, who's a memoirist and novelist, Rachel Howard, and she was giving a talk here at St. Mary's where I teach, and she said something like, when every story begins with once upon a time, like every story that's told, whether it's said or not, like that's kind of like, here we are now, and I'm telling you a story. And so I thought, in total desperation, I was just like, I guess I'll just try to start with those words. And I typed like once upon a time, and then the rest of the sentence came out, and it was in the third person. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I just kept going, and then I was like, oh, it was easy to write that. It was just the way it had to be written. I think I just needed to step outside and like kind of comment, or be outside the story enough to just tell it. And
yeah.
To the moment when the book begins, which is me sitting in my office writing this poem, like get all the way up there kind of. And then all the information was out of the way. Nobody needed any more information. And we were ready to go kind of.
So let's talk about this typewriter. I don't know if it's still part of it, the Royal Quiet Deluxe.
Yep.
It was handed down to you. It was an heirloom.
Yeah, it was my mom's. I actually, I don't. It's not in here. I have another Royal typewriter that's here. But it was my mom's typewriter from high school. And so when my grandparents moved down to be like near to my family in DC, and my mom grew up in Mamaroneck, near Westchester County, and so when we were moving them out, cleaning stuff out, this typewriter was in the attic, and my grandfather was one of those guys who like, everything is perfect, it was like perfectly oiled and cleaned, and so I opened it up and it was gorgeous, and I took it, and it was my mom's typewriter from the 50s, and it's a great typewriter, great machine, great action, just like really really just it's in a suitcase so you can carry it, and yeah, so I didn't use it for a while, but then when I was in grad school, and I write about this in the book, it suddenly, again, kind of out of desperation, I turned to it more to slow myself down, and it just worked beautifully. It was just the perfect thing I needed to slow my writing process down with the drafts, and having to retype each poem was great. And I also just love the machine, so yeah, it's still, I still have it. I still use it. I used to write letters, actually. sometimes.
What do you write with it now? Do you write poems with it?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes when I can. I mean, life is a little, it's I can't pull it out and set it up or whatever every time I want to write a poem. But yeah, I still do write it with it, and I'll write a letter if I want to write a letter to someone and they need a letter and not just like an email. I'll use the typewriter.
Huh. Yeah, and I love the word quiet in the name of the typewriter.
Oh, it's a great machine. It's a legendary machine. It's one of the great typewriters for sure.
Well, it's nice. It also makes it more musical. You're a musical person. Your son is very musical. But I think writing on a typewriter, people can call it pretentious, or there's even something kind of funny, I think, in the modern era where everybody's so digital and on their phones to just be banging away on a typewriter. There's a nice percussive aspect to it.
Absolutely. It's almost like the sound kind of pushes away. There's that quote that I talked about in White Poetry Bunch by Wallace Stevens, the pressure of the real, it's like everything. And then it's like the imagination pushes back against the pressure of the real. It's a violence from within that combats the violence from without. And there's something about the sound of a typewriter almost like kind of like creates this penumbra of like activity. It's like this is going on here. Don't no Twitter, no bullshit in here.
Right.
Like I'm doing this in here right now. And so yeah, I know I felt that. I felt it was physical, for sure. And the sound is great.
And you don't have that delete key as easily accessible.
No, and well, that's the thing. It's like when you write a poem, you have to what I would do when I was in grad school is I was like every time I had write a new draft, I have to retype it. So I mentioned this in the book, I think, but my first book, I mean, most of the poems, there's 150, 200, drafts, these piles of paper over and over and over and over and over again typing. And often there'll just be one word that's different, switching it back and forth, and it's just, I was just trying to figure it out. You just pull it out, stare at it, and you're like, it's not right. Got to do it again. And this would go on for hours and hours and hours. It was great.
So something that I notice whenever I read works of prose by poets, and it's not any great revelation, but I do notice that like line by line, there is a strength to the writing, and you can really feel like the poet's attention to detail, like word choice. Each line is really measured in your work and just kind of really beautifully musical. And this book is obviously about the process of making a poem. I'm wondering what your thoughts might be, having done both, about differences and similarities, when you're working in this mode as a prose writer.
Well, I'm so glad you asked this question because I thought it was kind of funny because why poetry, the basic thesis of why poetry is that.
And just for listeners, Why Poetry is, again, one of your previous books.
Yeah, it's a book of prose that came out in 2017. And it's the one that I mentioned earlier where I'm like trying to, to civilians, explain like what poems are, or like sort of undo a lot of teaching mishaps, that we had when we were, learning the wrong things about poems. So, but in that, one of the central arguments of the book is that poetry is a different genre, and that it's not, what's different about it isn't the language, like the language of poetry and prose and all use is all the same, but that the genre of poetry, it has a different purpose. And so the point of the book is sort of to play out like what that purpose is. And I think thinking about that purpose and understanding it as distinct from acts of prose or different things helps us get into poems. That was like kind of one of my big things that I argued. And so it was kind of hilarious to me to be like, what if I just write a book that has the exact opposite thesis in a way that a work of prose and a work of poetry can almost have the same purpose. Like there is no generic distinction between the two, and so I think that was sort of what was going on, like about with like turning that idea around, seeing like what's not true about what I said in Why Poetry, what's missing about that idea. And I think I love writing prose. I think I'm pretty decent on the sentence level. I'm terrible on the structure level. I mean, I really am. And I'm a mess, and I need editors and help and readers and stuff, because telling a story, if you can't already tell from this conversation, I get distracted, I drift, I can't, and so that's not an easy thing for me. So it was tough. And came out on the other end with a lot of respect for people who write memoirs and novels and any book length work of narrative narration. I'm just like, wow, that is really hard to pull off. You know, as grueling, incredibly grueling. I mean, poems like da da da, you do it kind of, and you know, like there's something light about that, but you got to grind if you're writing prose. You've
Yeah.
got to grind. Oof. You know, no way around it, right?
No, and at least not in my experience. If somebody out there has figured out a way around it, please let me know.
Or don't let us know. We'll
Yeah.
total jackasses.
But something I want to note is the fact that I've often said that I tend to get along really well with poets.
Yeah.
I have like an affinity for people who operate in that mode. I myself don't write poetry. I like to read it. I like to read it as a primer for writing prose. I like to, you know, it helps me kind of get the wheels turning. There's something about those, like that really distilled form of thought and language that helps me. And you write very well about the way in which poets really do, to a degree that is far from the norm. I mean, they live so far from the norm. Poets really are living outside of the common human experience and all of the structures of capitalism, and I admire people who find a way to live that life.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, my experiences is true for all writers. I don't know as many visual artists or, you know, I know some visual artists and composers. So I'm speaking about writers, but this may also apply to other artists, types of artists. So, but like, I think you have to put yourself outside or in opposition to what's going on in order to like free yourself from the way language is used. You know, you can't just repeat the way language is used all the time, especially commercial. I mean, it's particularly in our culture. The use of language is so I don't want to say contaminated, so permeated by commerce. And it's like and if you want to have any other kind of thought, it's like you almost have to like push away that use of language, slow it down, defamiliarize it, or whatever it is you want to say, and then and to start to even recapture your use of language, of words. And that's something that's been really interesting, by the way, about being with my kid, who has to work pretty hard to express himself through language. And I've watched him learn how to talk in a way that is probably, you know, I'm surely much more deliberate and like kind of requires more scaffolding than a neurotypical child would when they learn to talk. I mean, every parent has that experience. It's like their kids learn to talk. It's really cool. They say funny things. They figure things out or whatever. But that process has taken a longer time with my kid. And it's actually amazing to watch. It's like, it's really cool to watch him learn language. It's been moving, and it's reminded me of my own needs as a poet to stay outside of the fluidity of it.
Well, that's like some of the more poignant moments in the book have to do with this. There's something poignant about a poet and a writer of prose to be the father of a child who struggles with language, and to then work through all the emotional stuff that comes with that, you know, especially at the moment of diagnosis and in its immediate aftermath, the fear, the concern, the sadness and the heartbreak. But then as you move forward to realize that there are these striking similarities between the work that you do as a poet and the way that your son Simon processes. Yeah. And those kinds of little epiphanies are really cool and familiar to me. Maybe not the exact same ones for me and my child, but you do have these moments where you're like, oh, wow, like this kid is really extraordinary in these unexpected ways. Like your son is perfect pitch, incredible memory, recall.
Yeah, he does.
You know, so just like this, it's a different instrument, or it's functioning in a way that's not typical, but it's an extraordinary instrument. And
like all minds are. And I mean, he you know, but yeah, back to the language thing. I mean, he you know, when he says something, it is because he really had to work his way through it. And so when he says a piece of original language, which he does more and more now, it's he had to really think about it. And it's like, and that's what I aspire to in my writing. I want every single thing I write to feel that way.
Right.
Like it didn't come easy or just spill out of my mouth or just like, or just like I took it from the air and just, like right into the, I want it to feel worked through. And like, I mean, again, I want to say earned, but there you go. It's like, it's almost impossible to complete a sentence without using some kind of capitalist language, worked for, achieved, whatever. I keep failing to find the right term that doesn't reflect some kind of weird value, but it's just, he acts like how I want to be as a writer, and I love it. I love listening to him talk.
Right.
It's a total pleasure. It's great. And he also has the wisdom to not talk when he doesn't have anything to say.
Yeah. I
He
mean,
likes things to be quiet sometimes, and good for him,
totally. I think of, just randomly, you start to have an antenna for this, I think, when you have a child who has disabilities or is neurodivergent, but you start to like see people in the culture who have similar experiences. So, for example, Colin Farrell, the actor, I know has a disabled son. And so like, I'm now like, I feel like a connection to him. I don't know if you feel this way, but like Ernie Els, the golfer, has a child who I believe is autistic.
I don't know.
I could be wrong, but I remember seeing
there are definitely people. Yeah,
But I just remember seeing like a profile of him, where it was kind of a off the golf course type thing on ESPN or something years ago, but before my son came along. But something that he said has stuck with me and has taken on more resonance over time. And he just said that, like, I love to be in his world. He's like, I love to just hang out with him one-on-one. And it's just about being with him kind of on his terms.
Right.
And I relate to that very much, because some of the happiest moments that I have as a human being are those moments where I'm just hanging with him, doing his thing on his terms. And I think it's usually when we're removed from the world, we're at home. By contrast, some of the moments that are more challenging for me are when we're maybe out in the world. Like, my son has physical disabilities. So to be on a playground and to be around typical kids and to kind of see them climbing, like, all over the place. And then I'm the dad who's got to like climb up on the slide and go down the slide. And it's just that part of it emotionally for me. That's my shit,
No, but I mean, listen, don't be whatever. Don't be mean to my friend Brad.
Right.
but I mean, of course you feel that way. Of course you do. And that does not contradict in any way the love you feel for your son and your pride in him and your understanding that thing inside you comes from some, like, why is it that you feel that shame or that upset or that comparison, whatever. That's that famous expression, comparison is the thief of joy. We say that all the time in our house. And yeah, but that's the thing that you quoted that thing from the preface earlier about that how we willingly made ourselves instruments of this culture. Freeing ourselves of that has been amazing. Really, it's incredibly liberating. And yes, of course I have my moments, but I mean, I just think, again, when I have those moments, I think, okay, that's something broken in me, and also, why is the world a place where, that isn't built for everybody to be in? Why is the playground the way it is?
Right.
Yes. That's, and so I read somewhere someone said, and I wish I could attribute it. I can't. There's something like, what would the world be like if there were nothing? Like, could we imagine a world where no disability prevented anybody from doing anything? I guess there's a lot of that's like triple negatives or something in there. But like, what would a world look like where like someone who was sight impaired or hearing impaired or autistic or disabled and being in a wheelchair or whatever, physically disabled in some kind of way, like where their experience interacting moment to moment in the world was as easy as it is for people who are quote unquote normal or abled or whatever. And like, what would that world look like? And sometimes I sit in my, room or at night or whatever, and I try to imagine what would that world look like. And you start imagining things and everything seems like it'd be so much better if it were that way. Like, what if you didn't have to worry about a car coming screaming around the corner and knocking you over if you were sight impaired? What
Right.
would that world look like?
Right.
We could walk around and it wouldn't matter if you didn't always know exactly where you were, something like that,
Yeah.
So that's kind of been such an interesting ongoing thing that I've thought about. And of course it brings up a different issue, which is, I don't think we have time to get into really, but, about school and how how school is such a, it's such a narrow band of kind of like how kids are, seen and how they're expected to reproduce information and take it in. It's really a disaster, actually.
I
And
agree.
you
I
get a
agree.
lot of great people in those situations, especially in public school. Wonderful, amazing people, but they're trapped in a system.
That's right.
And it's tough. Oof.
It is tough. And like the thing about it, I think the great challenge for educators and for the system when it comes to addressing the needs of children with special needs and neurodivergent kids is that the diagnoses, even though they might have like some label, are so specific. Everyone's different. It's a spectrum, right? Autism spectrum, but disability, like my son is not a weird, but it's this very specific combination of things. And he has a very specific set of needs as a result. And so for the system to respond with agility to each individual kid that's the challenge, right? And it needs to improve
For sure. I mean, for sure. And somebody said something interesting to me once about that too, which was that, and I mean, again, I just can't help but keep thinking about how this relates to, our own practice of writing and what we're trying to do. But they said all the kids are struggling. All the kids are struggling to adapt themselves to this like kind of ideal way of doing things. And even the ones that seems that things are coming easy to, they're having their own issues, and you just don't see those things, or they're not brought out so visibly as they might be in with some other people. And that this system needs to change, and we need to change, and in so many ways. And I just think that, I'm interested in, I'm interested in revision. I'm interested in change. I'm interested in like constantly looking deeper and trying to find what's going on. And I'm very much inside that process. I mean, but being in it is better than not being in it. That's for sure.
No doubt.
Maybe it took this unexpected event in my life to push me there and my wife there or whatever, but I'm really grateful, for that. I don't walk around feeling like, something terrible happened and I wish it had never happened, actually.
Well, there is a point, I think you write about this, where you sort of get to a point as a parent of a atypical child where you can't imagine it being any other way.
Yeah.
Like they are who they are. That's my son. Yeah.
He's also awesome. I mean, it helps. He's awesome. And I get the feeling, your kid's pretty great too, but you have two kids, but like, I get the feeling. I see some pictures every once in a while and it's like kind of, but, my kid is awesome, and he's great the way he is. And so, we have some work to do as a lot of work to do as a world, and I tried to make the point in the book too, that like, there's something about that is like, common to all parenting. I think that when parents go wrong, I think it's where they don't really see their kids, and they don't realize that they're different from what they would expect.
Yeah.
And they're going to do their own thing. And sometimes that's very dramatic, and sometimes it's not. And it's almost more dangerous when it's not dramatic. I think that's where you can really run into trouble, whereas kids seems like they're just, easing along and they're kind of being the kid that you wanted them to be or whatever. And like inside, they're just like, there's something off about it because you're not really. And I think that sort of was my experience as a kid. Externally doing everything right, and internally feeling like something was really wrong.
Yeah, it's like something my wife and I say a lot is like, just meet them where they are, like especially my son, but also my daughter, who's
well, that's the teaching that we say that where I teach him I'm in school right now. That's one of the meet students where they are.
Right. And not and again, this gets back to what we talked about at the outset, which is acceptance, like accepting things as they are, accepting people as they are, and starting there rather than having some fixed idea or alternate idea of how they should be or how things should be.
Isn't that true for making art too? I mean, if you go into it with with this a rigid idea of what you want to do, and you just don't, you're unwilling to be changed, you're just like, this piece of writing exists for me to like say what I think and what I mean. And sometimes there's a time for that, for sure. But you know, you're not really going to be in the dynamic, responsive situation that you need to be in to really make something that's going to be reflective of, you know, of life and its actual complexity. I think a lot of the time I really believe that. And I you know, and I believe it because I've seen it in my own work, but also in a lot of other people's work. So that parenting and fathering and being a writer are close to me in mentality. You know, I think I say in the book something like, you know, I figured out a lot of things in writing that I hadn't figured out in life. So I had to catch up.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, something I noted about your book is its relative brevity. It's a shorter book. My book is shorter. I think that's what I was noting. I was like, oh, so we both wrote like about 200-page books about, in large part, you know, having an atypical child and the process of
right.
kind of coming to grips with that in some way. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about writing a book that's deeply personal and deals with family and painful stuff. Is it maybe natural to err on the side of shorter? Like I think about it personally. I cannot imagine writing like a 500-page book about this stuff. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably that there was something in there, but I think also just like for me, I kept thinking, you know, about the reader. And, you know, I don't know if you know this, Brad, but like a little poetry goes a long way.
Right.
There's a kind of famous anecdote about, I think Seamus Heaney and his wife or something. And his wife, you know, after reading, somebody says, oh, you could have read, you know, to Seamus Heaney, it's like, you could have read more poems. And his wife just said, no one has ever complained that a poetry reading was too short. You know, something like that, you know, it's like, and so, but I, you know, I think there's some kind of, and I also, yeah, I don't know. It's weird. I just didn't want to write a long book. I was like, I don't want to go on and on.
Yeah, I think
that get out.
but it's a great point that you make. Like I was talking about the emotional challenges of being the writer dealing with this material, and then you very wisely brought up the challenges of the reader that you have to be thinking about. You know, I think a book that goes into this kind of bracing territory and emotionally challenging territory, the reader can be appreciative of the fact that you're willing to go there, but also the fact that you're like economical in addressing, you know, you're not going on and on and on.
Yeah.
And I think too, on a related note, you know, this kind of goes back to a thought that you had a minute ago, but I want to get to it because I loved it. It has to do with being open and receptive in the creative process and not having a fixed idea that you're just kind of clinging to in art and in life. But something that was helpful to me when I read it and that I'd love to hear you talk about is this idea from, I believe, Brenda Hillman when it comes to revision, the revision process, which I think is where you can, you know, maybe you started with some sort of fixed idea or agenda as a creative person. And then in the revision, you sort of realize, oh, it's better if I deviate, and you follow that instinct to good effect. But something that she says is revise toward strangeness.
Yeah.
I love that.
One of her principles. I know, it's amazing. Think about that all the time. Yeah, go. Because I mean, I believe, I mean, this is especially true about a poem. I can't speak as much. I can't speak to a novel because I've never written one. But it's the moment that is most disruptive, or the moment that feels the strangest, or the ones you can't, the moment you can't paraphrase, you can't explain, but you sort of feel viscerally is an insight or something, or just beautiful. That's the sort of thing that's drawing you forward in your life and your imagination, you know. And that now, again, we are also just talking about my kid, actually, the same thing, but like, you know, but that, like, this is what that, and so it's what I say often about when I'm teaching poetry, like reading, you know, literature or whatever, is I'll say, you know, it's the part of the poem that most aggravates you, or you feel yourself most resisting, or you feel yourself confused by, that is the key to interpretation. That's the moment that tells you what the poem is, quote unquote, really about, at least for you, you know. And that's true for writing it too. You know, it's the part that bothers you. You know, it's the part that you and so I think somewhere in the book, there's that famous piece of advice, slaughter your darlings or whatever, like I don't know who said that, but like I want to say it was Faulkner, but it probably wasn't. But like, you have to you have to get rid of the thing that you're most attached to or feel is most beautiful in your work. Cause that's like sort of, some kind of mirage or ego projection or something like that or whatever. But which I think is probably true a lot of the time. But like in poetry, it's the opposite. You have to like get rid of all the other stuff. It's the weird jewel that you like somehow unearthed or landed in your life, some weird word or image or something. That's the thing you have to build the whole poem around, because that's really your insight. That's your imagination. So, that was what you talk about discovering things, in the writing. That's the thing that was true about writing poems. That's true about parenting for me. It's the rebuild your life around the thing that is different, strange, beautiful, precious. You're my kid, your kid, everybody's kid in a way. Rebuild your whole life around that. And then you'll have a life. And it's true for a poem too. It's like you have to rebuild everything around it. And that's exciting. It's fun, it's coming up with some kind of structure where that weird thing makes sense, that
Yeah.
life.
I mean, this is related, and I hope I have it right. I think it was Todd Goldberg. Todd. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Your friend and mine. And he, but I want to say he was, I don't know if it was him. I could be misremembering this. So apologies, Todd.
Let's give him credit.
Yeah, let's give him credit. But he was talking about his revision process and how he would sometimes like take like a 2.5, like a very low dose cannabis edible during editing. Shame. but I
ring the bell, shame.
But no, I think it's related to this idea of revising towards strangeness.
Yeah.
Like I get that. Like, oh yeah, once you've done the hard labor of drafting and you've got this thing out there and you've spent so much time with it, like you're sick to death of it in a weird way. I get needing to sort of come at it from a bit of an odd angle. Not too much, but like just a bit of a sideways angle. Sure. So that you can make it weirder.
And sometimes time is the best, if you don't have easy access to, a dispensary, I mean,
right.
I mentioned this in the book, put it in the drawer is what my friends and I, or poets, say to each other all the time, because if you leave something alone long enough, like for real, like if you just forget about it for a month or two, you reapproach it with a kind of strangeness that because you're not, like you said, inside it anymore. So sometimes really time is actually super helpful. And I think, by the way, that can be harder for prose writers because it's just like like put what in a drawer? Like I can't also just take 2 months off of this project, like all those things. I think the external pressures on people who write longer works like that, but there's some kind of equivalent, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It doesn't involve cannabis, although I'm not opposed to that solution also,
Just something. I think like I call it, like you call it putting it in the drawer. I call it like letting the text cool off.
Yeah, that's good.
But
like, how do you, as a prose writer, like how do you, like mechanically, how does that work for you? Because you could literally like put a poem in the drawer for a month and just completely forget about it and work on something totally different. And that's fine. You're not sort of like removing yourself from your work. But I think, like how practically would you do that with a work of prose?
Well, I mean, I think it's like one of the challenges would be being on deadline. If you're on deadline, that's a struggle. Then you might not have the luxury of putting it away for a month. I think if you can just not open the document for a month or two and really try to, like you say, forget about it, that's great.
Did you do that when you were writing your last book? Were you able to get I feel like you did, because you kind of like took a shot at it and then like you walked away from it and you came back. So maybe it was enforced on you, but did you have that?
Yeah, there were so many false attempts and like attempts to like get away from it, like to not address the thing. Like I went through this whole process, but I think that ultimately, ultimately I was just able to go through such a long, like drawn out process that I was able to see it ultimately. Like I really do feel like, for whatever flaws it may have, like that's the best I could do with this material. I continue to feel a peace about that book, but I also think that maybe one of the functions of having a longer process is that you end up writing other projects. Like you start something else. You'd be like, oh, well, maybe I'll try to do this. And I know that there are a lot of writers who work on multiple things at once. And I sort of get the logic of that when it comes to what we're talking about. If you can jump from one thing to another, it's a nice way to forget this one thing and to let it become new again.
I bet there are people listening who have their little tricks of ways of dealing with this. Like, I'm working on two things at the same time, and I can put one away and come back, whatever. People have different things they're doing. Like I said, it's just easier with poems because, you can be working on a bunch and they can all be in different stages at different times. And so it's easy to just put one away and not feel like you just halted yourself or whatever. And in this case, I mean, for me, it was like, there were parts of it I could put away because it's kind of like, one of those books that has like a lot of different kinds of thing that I'm doing in it. Like I could focus on one aspect of it for a while and leave something else out, aside for a month or two or whatever. Like, and that was, in this particular case, it was easier than it might be if you were writing I don't know. Maybe if you're writing a novel, you just write you work on a different part of it. I don't know. But like, yeah, I think even my naivete about how that works would be, but yeah, the hardest thing about the book was that you talked about the length of it. I mean, it was that sort of, I thought of it like a kind of like a fader, in a studio, and there's like kind of like some are up and some are down. It's halfway, and like, like how far to push one fader up, how far to push up the thing that's like about, maybe reading other people's poems. Like there's certain parts of the book where I read, Paul Celan or Stevens or Rupi Kaur or whatever. And like how, I could do that for another 20 pages, another 50 pages, another 100 pages. Like at some point it's gonna be too much, and at some point it's not enough. If you just did it once, it's like, why? So, all those like fader shifting things took me a long time.
Sure.
But then eventually I think just sort of blundered into a relative reasonable mix of them. And it helped to have my wife read it. She's an incredibly good reader. And she pointed out a few times when I went too far with something and I could just cut it back a bit or whatever,
I find like that as a reading experience, I love, like, this is I guess you would call a braided narrative, and there are different things happening in different story threads, that you're weaving together. And it creates, when it's done well, a really pleasurable like velocity, and it moves. That's the word.
People who do it very well, who I read, I mean, God, so many people. I mean, I feel like Vivian Gornick is just like one of those people who, like, I read one of her books and I'm in absolute heaven the whole time, start to finish, and I have no idea how she did it. Or a very different writer, Kate Zambrino, does that kind of thing. And it's like, how did she know how much of this and how much of that? Like, and I've never talked to her. I don't know her. I don't know either of those people, but like, I just, books like that you read and you're just like, man, you just have the right feel for like how much of this and how much of that to do it. And I always felt after I finished one of their books, like, oh God, I totally do not have that feel, so I just had to kind of just, keep going in and having editors and readers obviously helps.
Sure.
Great, thank God.
Well, there's something else that your book does, which I love, is that it's autobiographical, it's a memoir. So you're telling not just the story of your child, and not just there's not just these explorations of craft that we've been discussing, but it also traces some of the bigger moments in your, I think, education as a poet. I love the part where you're you're in Moscow at the University of Moscow, sort of like, it's like a very relatable experience at a certain stage of life where you're trying to kind of like make a grand gesture and do something and get out there. And then you get there and you're like, what the fuck am I doing?
Particularly when I was there, early, like, late 1990 in Moscow State University. I mean, the entire society was like literally collapsing.
Right.
It was kind of like maybe not the best place for like a 21-year-old to be, wasn't really equipped for that situation, but yeah.
Maybe a good primer for what was to come.
Yeah, I had no idea. Yeah, no, I mean, it was fun to write about the past, and a lot of that stuff I had to take out. There's more writing about like kind of, like sort of, yeah, like you call it education of a writer stuff, which I personally like reading, but I think it's kind of, yeah, I just definitely wanted to not, it just felt at some point like I was talking a lot about myself, you know, and I just didn't, I was like, it's enough, you know, it's just, but I thought the funnier or the more pleasurable anecdotes are just the ones that maybe like are a little more felt relatable, I guess, hopefully, were, you know, those are the ones that stayed in.
No, I think you managed the dials perfectly in those scenes. And I also loved, there's a section of the book where you go to Hawaii and you get to spend some time with the late W.S. Merwin. As a writer, I love stuff like that.
I'm glad you like. Yeah, I wasn't. That was something, you know, because I mean, so going back to the process of writing it, I mean, that's something that happened when I was writing that, you know, while I was doing that daily writing with Catherine, that happened. I was very fortunate to get invited to go visit him in his house in Maui. This was in late 2018, and you know, it turned out he died in March 2019. So it was a few months before he died. And, you know, I got an opportunity to go there. And so I went, and I was there with Lewis Hyde, who wrote The Gift, that amazing book, The Gift, and other books. And so, and I gave a few readings with him there, but, yeah, so just, and I, you know, and when I was writing it, I didn't know if that would like stay in the book or not. I had no idea. It was just what was going on for that week or whatever. But it ended up feeling like it was connected. You know, going to see like a pilgrimage to go see this person who's meant so much, whose literature, whose work has meant so much to me, you know.
And for listeners who don't know, W.S. Merwin spent his, you know, the back half of his life, or a good chunk of the back half of his life, on Maui, right? It was Maui.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then
it's called haiku, believe it or not.
Okay, and I mean, like, so on brand, right? But he lives in haiku, and he lived in he planted a forest with his own hands of palms and other.
Yeah, what he did is he basically he moved there and he was practicing Zen Buddhism, and that was like a big part of his life. But then he bought this old farm, you know, a disused farm or whatever, and he started he created like this preserve basically for rare species of palm trees. So, and planted them and built his house, built all the paths, and would plant these trees. So there are many species of palm trees that are preserved in this they call it a garden, but it feels more like a forest. You know, and that's what he was doing with his like hands and his energy and his life, you know, along of course with writing poems for 30 years.
God.
And it's amazing. It's an amazing place. You can go there. It's the Merwin Conservancy takes care of it. And W.S. Merwin, of course, amazing poet, you know, poet laureate, won every prize in the world or whatever. It's fantastic poet and someone who meant a lot to me personally. So getting to actually meet him was pretty incredible, I would say. And yeah, and just, yeah, again, a person who, yeah, something about bringing those trees from wherever they were and like replanting them there and keeping them safe also felt like highly symbolic to me in my own both life and writing practice.
Well, I cannot part company with you without noting that you performed somewhat similar function for me as I was writing my book. You appear in Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. And there are a few, and there, you know, for people who haven't read the book, there are a few podcast guests who kind of make appearances in the book. And Matthew is one of them. And I sometimes get asked, like, how did you choose? And I always say, I didn't really. Like, it just sort of happened.
Right.
Like at that particular moment of the writing, I was like, oh yeah. But the essay, there's a short bit of prose at the end of your poetry collection, Father's Day, which was meaningful and helpful to me. And boy, I'm blanking on the name of it. What was it called again?
Late Humanism, I think I called it.
Yeah, Late Humanism, right.
Title,
but which serves not only as a help to me in the writing of my book, and the conversation that we had last time on this podcast, you know, was illuminating and helpful, and just like it's always nice to meet other parents who are sort of in the same boat. But Late Humanism, this bit of prose at the end of Father's Day, you know, you kind of characterize as a bridge to Story of a Poem. Like that was the launching point, or at least one of the launching points.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of, I think that I sort of wrote that around the same time that I was writing the stuff that became in Story of a Poem. You know, so I was doing the daily writing, but then when I wrote that piece of prose, it was right at the end. So basically what happened is I had most of that book, Father's Day, done. And then I was sort of finishing up with a few last poems when I started writing the stuff that was in Story of a Poem. You know, so there's kind of an overlap Like, and so the poem that I write in Story of a Poem actually appears in Father's Day, that poem, Our Custody. And then also that piece of prose you're talking about was also written during that same time. So obviously there's like a natural kind of overlap of the concerns. And yeah, I mean, it meant a lot to me to talk to you at that point too, because I was much earlier on, and I don't know, it was very comforting, I guess, for lack of a better term, to like connect with you about that. And we don't know each other that well. I mean, I wouldn't say, we don't hang out or whatever. I mean, don't
Not yet.
not yet. but I mean, but it just, yeah, like dads who are going through, something different than they expected.
Right.
And like, and it's, there's a lot of life and a lot of joy in these parenting experiences, but they're tough, and you need solidarity for sure.
Well, it's been great to catch up with you again, and congratulations on Story of a Poem. It's a really beautiful book, and it's a book that I think, a lot of readers will enjoy, but I think in particular, if there are readers out there who might be going through something similar, they will find it to be a kind of life raft, which I think books of this kind can function as, when somebody's coming from a really personal place and is trying to make sense of things, for himself or herself. It just performs that function for me. And I always like to end by asking if there's anything else in the works. It's fine if there is not, but is there another book or project that you are working on?
New poem. It was great to get back to poems after this, and I've been in poems, and I wouldn't say they are particularly personal. I think it's been nice to, I missed being able to kind of sing, I guess, for lack of a better term. So I've really just been writing a lot of poems, and they're not, they aren't like particularly autobiographical, I would say, or whatever, which has been super nice and really great. So yeah, poems. I haven't really no prose work, thank God. That'll murder me. So, yeah. But I do want to say too that, I really loved your book, Brad, and I really appreciated it, and it meant a lot to me too. And I think that, I would say about your book, and I hope this is true about mine, that they will connect with people, anybody, because everybody has to join, has to realize that life is full of stuff that you did not plan on. And like, that's a hard truth. And it's an obvious one, but it's not, it's one thing to know it. It's another thing to live through it. So it's particularly true about parenting. So anyway, I really appreciate you and your work and everything you do. And yeah, so it's good. It's good to talk.
Well, thanks so much again for taking the time. I wish you all the best with this book and whatever comes next.
Thanks. You too.